Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on Tibetan Buddhism and death, which is a really rich topic. I would say that of any of the religions that I've looked at over the many years, Tibetan Buddhism has the most intricate and rich traditions about death, dying, and rebirth. So let's take a look at it. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the most famous of all Tibetan texts, and many scholars have argued that it's the Tibetan text that is the most translated of any of the texts around. Now, the text's actual name is Bardo Todal, which means something like the text that liberates through hearing in the intermediate state. Bardo means intermediate state. This was written by Karma Lingpa, who was a Nyingma, and he was a treasure revealer, so a Tibetan. So he would be one of these guys that would wander around and he would find the treasure texts that Padmasambhava had hidden all across Tibet. Did he discover them within his mind through the psychic visions, or did he discover actual physical texts that were hidden in the landscape? It's hard to say. I go with in his head. Anyway, so Karma Lingpa, who lived from 1326 to 1386, is the purported author of this text, though he would argue that it is a treasure text that was found by him or revealed to him. Right off the bat, I would argue that I will make the point that, like I said, the text is the Bardo Todal, the text that liberates through hearing in the intermediate state, does not sound at all like Book of the Dead. So the original translator, Evans Wentz, gave it that title, that is not a translation of its actual title, because it reminded him of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which it has no relationship to whatsoever. So let me sort of summarize to you sort of the long textual history of this book in the West. So the first translation was written by a guy who was an American who did not know Tibetan, but he had contact with a number of Tibetans that he met traveling in India. He found this text and had this sort of school teacher administrator translate it, and he always gave him credit for it. And this guy, Evans Wentz, was the one that titled it the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He had previously written some books on fairy lore in Scotland. He wrote 3 other books on Tibetan matters throughout the course of his life. All right, so then it was translated in the 1960s by Timothy Leary and a number of other Harvard psychology professors, one of whom became Baba Ram Das later. And that text was called the Psychedelic Experience. In this, they sort of mapped out the ways that the Tibetan Book of the Dead talks about the periods between death and rebirth, and mapped it on to the LSD psychedelic experience. So when people would have terrifying experiences, they would say, no, you must merge into the scary deity that is only a projection of your own head. I mean, this is not what Tibetans had in mind. Tibetans do not have sort of an ethnogen, pathogen, or ethnogen sort of tradition, but the Indians might. But you know, these college professors figured out a good way to adapt the Tibetan Book of the Dead into a way to have people have more successful psychedelic experiences. Then in 1975, it was translated by Chogyam Trungpa and Francesca Fremantle. Chogyam Trungpa ended up founding a very important religious institute out here called Shambhala and a university called Naropa. He was propagator of what they call the crazy wisdom. He was one of these 1960s, 1970s sort of charismatic gurus who, despite being a very high up Kagyu Lama, would actually dress in a business suit all the time. He's an interesting character. All right, so in the 1990s, Robert Thurman, father of Uma Thurman, who previously was a monk when he was younger, a Tibetan Buddhist monk, and as a student of the Dalai Lama, did the first proper academic translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But he even adds a whole bunch to his translation that is very Western influenced. There was a guy named Sogyal Rinpoche, who's still alive, who did not do a translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but he wrote a book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which explains a lot of the lore that is found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead in a way that's much more accessible to Westerners. It's a classic. Take a read through it sometime. It's a very good book. In the last 20 years, 2 more translations have come up, both with proper Tibetans with academic bona fides behind their names, that are quite good. My favorite adaptation of this book in popular culture is a movie called Jacob's Ladder, which is a movie about a man who has these horrifying visions that begin to happen in his daily life. And it's later revealed that he was killed in Vietnam, and he's acting, and these visions are him sort of dealing with the process of coming to accept that he is dead and be reborn. But evidently he was killed in Vietnam by another American soldier after they were slipped a psychedelic drug. So look, in between state, psychedelics, all together in a horror movie. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead has quite a bit of connections to American culture. In particular, the sort of religious groups that really pick up on ideas of the Tibetan Book of the Dead are not just Tibetan Buddhism people, but people who are really into psychedelics and people who are doing lucid dreaming. And as I talk through a little bit more of this, you might be able to see the connection that you can have, that if you can get your brain to do the stuff that the Tibetan Book of the Dead says you should be able to do in your waking life, if you do it in your dreams, it would be quite profound. All right, so what are the contents of the Tibetan Book of the Dead? The text, in fact, and this is why the name the Tibetan Book of the Dead is not a very good or accurate translation of the title, mostly because it doesn't have to do with the title, but because it's really not a book about death. It's a book about rebirth. So what the text does is it's a guide for the deceased, for the, not necessarily the soul, but for the deceased person to move from death to rebirth. The text urges the deceased to, 1, recognize that their own essential meaning, or their own essential state, remember this is enigma text, is essentially light, perfect, luminous, and all expansive. And so the text calls to the deceased and says, you, Aaron Ulrey, have died. You are experiencing your own consciousness right now. Now, realize that that is you, merge with it, realize it is all clear light, and become liberated. And should that fail, 2, the second thing that it really tries to get you to do is to tell the deceased person to not become afraid. Because the idea is the deceased is in this transition state, which is called the Bardo, the place in between, or Antarabhava in Sanskrit, the in-between space. And sort of like this dream body, but it's really chaotic. You know how in a dream you're like, oh, I'm driving a car, now I'm in a submarine, now I'm having tea with Winston Churchill. It's just all like that, and you're all scattered and whatnot, flitting around. That's kind of what the state in between death and rebirth is like. And you'll constantly become afraid and concerned and weird, and you'll whoosh from this to this to this, and you get confused, and the next thing you know, you're reborn. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Bardo Todal, calls to you to say, hey, you, whoever your name is, you're dead. You're going through these horrible visions. I'm going to explain them to you. Don't get scared and be calm so you can make good choices here so you won't have a negative rebirth, so you're not fearful. So what's the process? It's a 49-day period between death and rebirth. So you die, 49 days, then you are sort of reincarnated, and 9 months later, you're born. That's the system. This is divided in various sections. So the first thing happens when a person dies is they see clear light. Again, not butter tea. Somewhat sadly, it's not butter tea. First, the person dies. They leave their body, and the first thing they experience is just this clear, radiant light. That, remember, these are enigmas. So Dzogchen, that is your essential nature. Clear, radiant light. But they get crazy and fearful and whatnot, and they can't handle it, and boom, they move to the next spot. The next thing they see is these beautiful, peaceful deities, peaceful Buddhas. But they get confused and can't stay there and crazy, so they run off again. The next thing they see is really, really scary Buddhas, so wrathful Buddhas. The text describes them as like the blood-drinking, corpse-grinding, flesh-eating deities. And so you become really scared. You're, ah! You try to get away from them, and all those peaceful and wrathful deities come together and become the Lord of Death, Yama, the god of death. And he's really scary. So he sets you off to run, and you run, until you see a whole bunch of like animals and people, and like all sorts of creatures, and they're copulating like mad. And the one that the person is attracted to, they go toward, they merge with, and that becomes their parents. 9 months later, reborn. There you go again. All right, so like I said, this is a Nyingma text. So the Nyingmas advance this sort of completion and perfection rights of Dzogchen, the great perfection. They're going to continually argue that your mind as it is, if you can recognize it, is clear, radiant, luminous light. So they will argue that you can find this at any time. Now, making it last, I mean, you can have the mystical experiences, and lots of people do. They would say, in fact, every time you have consciousness, you're having that mystical experience, but we can't recognize it, hold on to it, or make it last. So at any time during this period in the Bardo, or for that matter, at any time during life, the deceased may see that all the appearances that they are seeing are just movements and projections of the mind. And underneath all of that is just pure light. And if you merge with that pure light, you can become liberated. Now, many Tibetans will argue that these deities are constructions of the human mind, and thereby they're culturally instructed, i.e. us Westerners are going to see angels and demons. That said, the structure of seeing clear light, seeing peaceful deities, wrathful deities, and then copulating creatures, they would say everybody sees that. That's the process. However, the contents can be different. It reminds me of a line out of that movie, Jacob's Ladder, where the main character has had a horrible experience, and a doctor friend of him looks at him after helping him out, and it's a really pleasant scene. And the character looks up at him and says, "You ever read Meister Eckhart?" Meister Eckhart's a very important German mystic. The guy says, "No." He says, "How'd you get a philosophy degree without reading Meister Eckhart?" He says, "Well, look, here's the deal. If you believe that you are in hell and there are demons torturing you, you will be horribly suffering. But if you look clearly, you'll see that they're just angels and they're burning away your attachment to the world." That's a very Tibetan Book of the Dead kind of argument. So the next time you see demons, be sure they're not angels helping you move on to your next phrase. This is me telling you the next time you're in the in-between state between life and death, if you see a demon, realize the demon is an angel. The angel is an aspect of your own mind. Merge with that and become pure light. That's your message for the day. All right, so what are some of these conscious death practices that we find in the Bardo Todal? Well, the first one is get your head straight. So the practitioner memorizes these sources and sort of internalizes the structure of death and the way that the Bardo, the intermediate state, operates, so that will be obvious to them when they die, and they can either get liberation or they can consciously go through the death process, not be afraid, and make a good choice when they see the copulating creatures to be reborn. So that's one thing. You know the process, you recognize it when you're in it. One of the other techniques, and there's tons of writing on this throughout the Tibetan tradition, not just in this Bardo Todal, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's called Poa. So in this, one practices leaving the body in order to enter the pure light. The consciousness is coalesced into a single syllable, usually right here in your heart. And then you practice by going, hey, hey, and moving it up a little bit up the central channel along your spine and out through your head. I was initiated into this 25 years ago on my first trip to India. I met this Nyingma Lama and I sat with him for about 2 weeks and he taught me these techniques. And it's powerful. And you do get to a point where you can really you can draw your entire being and conscious awareness into the heart, and you can see the central channel. He had a cool diagram of it that he would instruct us on. And then you practice meditating, moving that conscious up and out so it goes out of your head. Now, one would say, won't that kill you? And we asked him that, and he said, no, I got you covered. So at the end of the practice, we had an Amitabha medicine Buddha visualization practice that would fill us up with radiant light that would heal whatever damage had been done by practicing expelling the consciousness out of the body. All right, so that's Poa. There is another little bit of it, and I talked about you for a sense here. You should be meditating and practicing at merging into things. Whether this is mental images that you have in your head, or you like look around, you like see a car and you're like, I'm going to merge into that. I'm going to blend myself into that. So you practice doing that all the time. The idea is it becomes a reflex So when you're in the Bardo and your brain's all nutty, you're like, oh, look at that thing. You're like, I'll merge into it because I have that habit. And then you merge into it and hey, you're liberated. You never know. So the text itself, the Bardo Todal, has the title of Liberation Upon Hearing. So how this works is when a person dies, the Tibetan Lama or just a person will come who's an expert reciter and will read this book over and over and over again for those 49 days. The idea is that the dead linger around their bodies for a while. The idea is that your name still works, no matter where you are out there, your name still works. So I can say, hey, Dr. Ulrich, don't get afraid. Listen to me. I'm going to read to you about what's going on right now. And then you read through the text, which is broken in like chunks of a time frame. So like every 7 days, there's a shift and something that happens in the journey of the soul. And the idea is you can call to the soul and say, hey, buddy, this is what's going on right now. Don't be afraid. I got you. We'll move through this together, which is kind of cool. All right, so overall, the argument there is that they get the attention of the dead, they tell the dead what are going on, and they say, now merge with the pure light, and if you can't merge with the pure light, just stay calm and make good decisions from here on out. I wanted to make sort of a Western comment here. Socrates, via Plato, of course, said that all philosophy is preparing to die. This idea the Tibetans take really seriously. I mean, remember that the first noble truth of Buddhism is all this surely is suffering and impermanent. And what proves impermanence more than anything than death? To which they would say, you have to do religious practice right now because death is coming, my friend. Don't dig a well while your house is on fire. Get out of the house. So death is guaranteed. Tibetans, I would say, are not obsessed with death. Some Westerners have looked at a lot of this discourse and said, these Tibetans are obsessed with death. I don't think they are. They think about death a lot. But, you know, death is not taboo. I mean, we talk about sex all the time, but we really don't talk about death. Sure, we'll watch movies where people die, but we don't really talk about our own deaths or what happens with death. This is sort of the opposite of the Victorians in the Western world who were obsessed with death but wouldn't talk about sex. So we're kind of the opposite. The Tibetans don't have a taboo around death. So they've developed these techniques to die well and to die consciously. So what's the real, why should we be thinking about death all the time? Well, we go back to Tsongkhapa, the great Tsongkhapa, who lived from 1357 to 1419. We remember that he was not the first Dalai Lama, though his disciple was one of the first Dalai Lamas, was Dalai Lama #1 for that matter. But Tsongkhapa was considered an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, and he's the founder of the Gelugpa school. So he has this wonderful discourse about being mindful about death and meditating upon death. And his idea was that really understanding death supports and spurs on Buddhist practice. Death is stalking about you at all times. There is no way to escape it. So we have to work and we have to work quickly because death is coming. And this rhetoric is well developed in Indian sources, but it's even more developed in Tibetan sources. Now, what we read for today is a selection from a piece of writing he did that's called Lamrim, which means stages in the path. Now, Lamrim, as a genre, is sort of supposed to be a way to distill all Buddhist doctrine that one would need from all the scriptures into one spot so any person upon reading them and practicing them can get liberation. Now, the Gelugpas love this style of writing. I find it tedious. It's actually quite lovely. It's written in very nice Tibetan, but Lamrim stuff, these stages and paths, are just this general, like, you do this, you meditate on 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 this, and then eventually you get moving through all those stages and all those paths, you get to the point where you can gain Buddhahood. Okay. One thing we do know about Tsongkhapa is he was a ferocious debater and a heck of a scholar. And if you'll notice when you read in the primary text, his writing really is clear. And it translates very well into English. It's just, you know, I don't know. I want to go up onto the mountaintop and hang out with the Nyingmas and and experience the purity of mind. Remember these, the Gelug's like, no, you're going to study for 12 years before you even really begin to do any of this meditative retreat stuff. Teach their own. But Tsongkhapa has some really excellent writing on death and the reasons for being very clear on why you should meditate upon death. Tsongkhapa has a great argument about the rarity of human birth. So we just think, human birth happens, whatever. But Tsongkhapa makes this argument, and I think he's paraphrasing Atisha, I can't remember, that the rarity of the human birth can be summed up in this way. There's a turtle on a vast ocean. Also on that ocean is a golden ring. That turtle comes up and pokes its head up every 100 years. The rarity of the human rebirth is that he pokes his head up within that 100 years and it goes through that ring. That's how rare it is to be human. So since we're human now, and only in the human realm can we attain liberation, we have to practice and we have to be very aware of how rare our human existence is. So he argues that we need to contemplate the certainty of death. So death cannot be avoided. It happens to all people. The one guarantee is death and taxes, and you can avoid taxes, but you can't avoid death. And he's obviously ignoring all of the work of the immortal alchemists, and I will too, because they weren't immortal. If they were, they'd be around. We could talk to them. The lifespan of a human being is completely unknown. We can never know how long that we're going to live, but we do know that by every moment our lifespan is shortening. All pleasure is compromised because death can come at any time. So the only thing you should really be doing is religious practice. However, there's no natural time or opportunity to do religious practice. We don't naturally do it. So you have to make that time, knowing that death is coming at any moment for you. We don't know when we're going to die, so we need to meditate upon the uncertainty of the time of death. In this realm, we live 100 years at the most. In other realms, deities or creatures and people born there, like in a godly realm, can live thousands of years or millennia or even whole eons. But that's not the case. We are human. We got 100 years at most. There are so many ways you can die and so few ways that you can be saved from death. Death is everywhere. The body is fragile. You can be struck down by anything at any time. Illness, accidents, death is coming. It is coming at all times. The first noble truth, all things are impermanent. At the time of death, your friends can't help you. And he does not posit that a lama can come and do the death rituals for you, though I will, I'll describe that a little bit more in a second. Your wealth can't help you. It doesn't matter how much money you have. The rich and the rich and the poor, we all die the same. There is no body. Your body cannot help you. It doesn't matter how strong and powerful and potent you did, how many bicep curls you did. At some point, your body will go weak and you will die. Death is everywhere. There is no way to escape it. But maybe there are some opportunities in dying. Remember we have these Nyingma texts, and Germano extracts a wide number of death rituals and death technologies from Nyingma sources. Now, we'll notice that throughout these texts, there's a regular appeal to, hey, realize your pure mind. That's the Dzogchen, that great perfection that is there at all times that seems so simple but is so difficult. The Nyingmas will also argue that the Bardo, the stage between life and death, is an important one. We have all this lore about it, but if you really look, you can see that at any point we're always in a Bardo, we're always in a state of transmission, of transition, and at any point, if we become awakened, we can become liberated just by seeing that we are essentially pure light without content, diffuse and everywhere. So I like that the title of the article we read today, Dying, Death, and Other Opportunities, I think is really important because he notes that death is not this complete ending. It is an opportunity. It is an opportunity for advancement, which is, I think, a good way to look at death as instead of a termination, but an opening into something else. Unless you believe that we're all just dead in the ground, we're all worm food, which is where I kind of lend myself anyway. And then I would say there is no opportunity to death. Death is real, death is horrible, and death is permanent. but that's me. And I'm kind of a downer. I get very down to these sorts of things. So what I wanted to talk about are some of the contents of Germano's text, which are quite interesting. One of the first things he talks about are these 21 signs of death. Now, this really pulls on a lot of Indian material about how to divine when death is coming. We see that there are 21 ways of figuring out that death is impending and how long it will be until it occurs. I'll tell you, when I read these, my eyes glaze over and I'm like, all right, I'm not a master in medicine or anything. So, signs are often about the body, like the behavior of the limbs or the eyes or the teeth or whatnot. And then you can look at that and figure out when somebody's going to die, how far it is off. Now, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. The people that are interpreting these ideas are supposed to be advanced psychic lamas. So the signs that we would go like, yeah, that guy's got a funny spot on his gum. How do you know he's going to die from them in like 8 days? But the lama would look at that and then also use his psychic powers to interpret it even further. So I would say that that these signs might seem vague to us, but I'm going to assume that for the enlightened lama, it works a little bit better. One of the other things we see is they have some technologies for reversing impending death. The idea is that if you figure out death is coming in 5 days, there are meditative practices that can put off this death for a time. Now, this isn't that you ward off death forever. The idea is that as the winds, the various winds in the body, as they condense and shut down, you can expand them again, so you can get a little bit more time to, get a lama there to do the death rites, to practice poa really quick, to get your head all straight. So it's ways for reducing impending death, but only for a short time. Sometimes a lama can actually come to a recently dead or mostly dead person and revive them through a combination of meditation and sort of psychic CPR, where they breathe and meditate in a way that can bring a person back to life for a short period of time. But again, this is not to save them. It's to do the rituals so they can have a better rebirth. Now, we are looking at this sort of death process, and the Tibetans have thought about this quite a bit. They argue that the body elements and winds dissolve slowly until it is time to die. You can meditate on this process so that you can know it so well that when it happens, you know what's going on, so you're not scared. You internalize the process so you don't react with fear and can react properly to have a good rebirth, and you can die peacefully, which ain't a bad idea. Also, so in this practice, you can meditate you can do meditation in a way that is sort of, how would I put it, practicing dying. You practice dying so that when dying actually comes, it can go better. Germano gives a title called The Oral Precepts for the Dying. On this, I'm going to talk about POA, again, consciousness transference, and the Bardo, which is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So what POA does, and I'm going to explain the process to you, is it projects the consciousness outside of the body during life so that a practitioner can do so at that death moment with relative ease. So the practitioner visualizes his or her own form as the yidam and as the lama. Remember, that's that deity yoga stuff. It all comes back. So you do that, and then you imagine the central channel, which in Sanskrit is called the sushumna, and it goes all the way from your root self at the anus and genitals, all the way up to the fontanelle at the tip of the back of your head. And it's usually described as being like a bluish white. Then one takes their entire consciousness and crystallizes the consciousness in the heart with the syllable ah. And at that syllable ah, and that looks kind of funny in English, it looks kind of cool in Tibetan. You begin to move it just a little bit, bigger and bigger and bigger, while saying hink, hink, and pop, 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 until you project it all the way out the head. Now, if you do this really well, supposedly it'll cause like a little bit of blood, maybe, right there, and there'll be a sign that you've been successful on that, and then a lama will come by and go hoink, and I'll put like a strand of straw that's like almost like a piece of spaghetti, and twink, it'll stick in your head in that little hole. Again, I've seen this happen. I don't get it. It seems like a trick, but hey, it's kind of interesting. All right, so the idea is that you practice condensing all of your consciousness into that ah, into that flaming white ah, and then shooting it up out the central channel. Now, as I said before, the problem is, don't you think shooting your consciousness out of your body could, I don't know, kill you or cause some damage? Well, I asked the Lama about this one time. He said, yeah, I follow your point. I got what you're saying. I don't know why he talks like that when I tell us. I know what you're saying. What we'll do is we'll do an Amitabha medicine Buddha after that. He'll rain down a pot of nectar into your body and it'll undo any damage from this practice. That's my Lama voice. All right, so that's what you should practice doing to die consciously in the Tibetan tradition. Now, a Lama can come by in some traditions and do this for a person. So in this way, the Lama can come and visualize your consciousness and shoot it out your head using his psychic power, or you can be trying to do it and have difficulty, and he can intervene and help you do it in some sort of way. I like the idea of somebody being able to do the poem for you. The writer Sogyal Rinpoche, who's an Nyingma guy, and he wrote the Tibetan Book of the Living and Dying, argues that this should be practiced so often that it becomes just a natural thing that you do all the time. And he tells a story about one of his students who was riding a horse, and she got thrown from the horse, but her foot was caught in the stirrup, and she was being dragged behind the horse, and she realized, I could die right here. So she started doing poa. And he's like, that's how you should practice. Like, you get into a car accident, instantly doing poa. Find yourself becoming sick, instantly doing poa. You should be ready to do it at any time. Get into a fist fight, poa. I actually think duck, maybe, but, duck, throw a couple of punches. But you should constantly, at any point that you're in danger, instantly do that poa thing. Now, because I did these practices, and I don't really do them now, to tell you the truth, I have found some weird carryovers. I know that in my dreams, sometimes I'll meet something very scary, something horrifying, and I don't merge with it per se. But I have had points where I've died in my dreams, and I felt all my conscious connect, and get right into my heart and sort of shoot, and then everything dissolve into light. So maybe it's that I internalized these practices that I heard about so much and read about, but there is a sort of wild carryover into our dreams. And to that point, I asked a teacher of mine one time that if the state of the soul in the intermediate state was the same as the state of the soul in the dreams. And he kind of hemmed and hawed on it. But I would say it is. How you will act in the intermediate state is the same as how you act in dreams. So think about your dream self. Mine sucks. Maybe yours is kind of awesome, but mine sucks. And I'm pretty sure that suckiness will translate into the intermediate state if I ever end up there. Okay, so the other thing that can happen is you can read the Book of the Dead, the Bardo Todal, to the dead. Now, in this, if someone cannot accomplish POA, or if they worry that the POA fails, or, come on, it's not happening. You can't really, there are some signs that goes well, but they're not consistent. So Tibetans, pretty much for the most part, will want to have the text read for the dead when they die by their corpse. So what happens is, while the deceased travels through successive realms, from pure light to pleasant deities to wrathful deities to the Lord of Death to creatures copulating in rebirth, the person is still connected to their name, their body, and their life. So reading the text around the body and calling out to the person will cause them to hear the text as it's being read and to get their head straight, to keep them calm, to keep them from making poor choices and rushing into a negative rebirth. Ultimately, the book is broken up into different stages, and they're like, okay, he's in this state right now, he's in this state, and then we'll read this. It's really important to read it this time. So the book will kind of map and be read at specific times to help the dead along their journey. And ultimately, the goal is to get the person to get to that point where they see the copulating creatures and to choose a human Buddhist rebirth, because it's very rare to be born in a time where Buddhism exists, to have a body and a mind that is not defective, to be in a country where that Buddhism is practiced, to be able to encounter the scriptures and meet a teacher. All of those, that's a lot of options. If Buddhism is the only way to become liberated, it's incredibly rare that you can even, in the many ways you could be reborn, to even hear these doctrines. there are a few signs of rebirth. As they're looking at the body, Tibetans will look, and they will look for specific. Some are more vague, but well, how to put it this way. A sign of a good rebirth is a sign of a good death, the soul leaving the body in a normal way. So if the corpse immediately has a little bit of blood coming out of the top of their head, perfect. If the corpse immediately defecates, that's bad. It pretty much all maps. And that comes out of sort of Indic understandings of how corpses behave. The other thing that they can do is they try to do rituals to remove the possibility of a negative rebirth. At the brink of death, you can do poa for someone. You can visualize the at their heart and also breathe that or breathe into the person and move. So a lama can visualize the right at the center of their heart and then breathe while saying mantras upon the person to move that consciousness to go out in the right way. After someone has died, you can chant various mantras to infuse the corpse and move the soul to be reborn in a better way. You can also bless holy waters with mantras and anoint the corpse in a specific way to help them have a better rebirth. And even after the person has been cremated, they do this ritual where they'll make up this like special like little card. It's like an effigy that stands in for someone, and then they can do the death rituals for that, you know, like effigy. So it'd be like, you know, I'd write your name and a little diagram of you, or look at your picture or something like that, and then do those poa rites or any of the other rites as if that card was a stand-in for the human body. All right, so our final thing I wanted to talk about are these people called Delok, these death voyagers, those who have gone beyond Delok. It makes sense in Tibetan. So who these are they are normal people, or mostly women, who suffer an illness or are suddenly incapacitated, and they die. And they go on these journeys, and they generally come back and describe hell. They describe these hell realms. They rarely speak of heavenly realms. Sometimes there are dudes, but it is mostly women. And sometimes they will talk a little bit about heaven. But I have a friend that's done a lot of ethnography on this. You say, oh yeah, all they ever talk about is the hells. Now, based on these experiences of the hells, they become sort of like traveling ministers who encourage people to behave well and support Buddhism, because whatever you do in life is going to affect what happens in death. They get a little hectoring. They're like, because you're doing this and this and this, this is the horrible hell you're going to have. One joke of my friend turned to a community of people who were hanging out with one of these Deloks and said, wow, she really knows a whole bunch about hells. And they basically said back to her in Tibetan, yeah, she sure says she knows a lot about hells. So there's some dubiousness even amongst the Tibetan cultures. These are not psychopomps. A psychopomp is a phrase in anthropology, mostly anthropology of shamanism. And a psychopomp is someone who can guide the soul after death into a heavenly realm, and we find these across religious traditions. Okay, so, but where do these ideas come from? So where are these hells? They definitely travel through these hells, but their understandings of hell realms seem to be based mostly on Indian texts, and there's quite a bit of writing on the hell realms and what the hell realms are like in Indian traditions. However, we don't see a tradition of people coming back from the dead and describing that hells in Indian traditions. You do see it in Chinese traditions. So there seems to be sort of like Indian content with a Chinese function, but this is a very Tibetan phenomenon. We do notice that almost all Buddhist cultures have sort of extensive understandings of hell realms. I know I've been in Thailand and I've gone to museums that are just hell realms. It's like, and you walk through them, and people go to these all the time, like it's Disney World. And you're like, oh, well, there's the hell where people are beaten with iron bars. There's the hell where people are devoured by giant beasts. Their sins were this, their sins were that. So this notion of the intricacies of hell is universal. And Lord knows we have plenty of this writing and speculation and the art of the Western world, as I put the pictures up here, these sort of Grand Guignol kind of looks at these hellish realms. Okay, so should these Delo, well, another thing I want to say is that these should be differentiated from other bodhisattvas who like go to the hells to rescue someone and bring them back, or go to the hells and become so horrified and compassionate that they generate sort of Buddha realms where people can be reborn into, where they're guaranteed salvation. This is not what these are. These ladies just come back and give sort of moralistic lectures about how you're all going to hell if you don't act right and get your shit straight. So it's a very practical religion. I mean, the reality is that very, very few people are ever going to get liberation. So even when you go to like relatively high up lamas and they give talks to general people, they're just like, oh yeah, Buddhism is generally good and you should behave well. And you're like, can you explain to me how POA works? Like, get an empowerment, meet with me later. There's a general Dharma talk. It's just be good. Buddhism is good. That's it. They're kind of in that realm. They're not going to give you sort of intricate teachings on philosophy or theology. These Daylokes are just going to be like, no, you're all going to hell. Stop behaving so poorly. Quit smoking and sleeping around, or you're going to hell. That's what's in store for you. The big doctrine, in fact, is karma. Karma is the thing they talk about, and that all that you do will have, all of your actions will have fruits, and it's important to be a good person. The literary texts are written in a very clear Tibetan, and from ethnography, when these ladies are interviewed, their language is clear, not complicated, and it's just really practical. These are different than nuns, or called anis. Now, I don't know how much I've been into this, but there is no tradition in Buddhism that has full ordination of nuns. This is new. Only in the last 50 years have people started fully ordaining nuns. Nuns could never become fully ordained like Buddhist monks. So when nuns are even being nuns, there's a challenge to the monastic order in that they always want to be ordained, but they can't, and it's a rival institution to a monastery. So these Daylokes are just like, no, Buddhism's good. We support the monasteries. We support the Sangha in every way. There's not the same challenge to the monastic order from Daylokes as you would find from nuns. So what are the implications here? What we see is that there is an idea of soul flight. So the idea is that the soul can move about and go through various realms. So that's interesting. We find that throughout Tibetan stuff. We find that the literary texts are pretty standard when the Daylokes describe things, but we find in ethnography that they're actually more innovative, and that the Daylokes do bring their own interpretations to these hell realms and to the ideas they present. We also see that throughout the Buddhist world, and throughout the Western world, people like hell stories, and people like this, be good or you're going there. And in this sense, we're not so different in the West with our, writings of Dante or our televangelists warning us that, you got to go hell if you're going to go to hell if you don't get right with God. Everybody loves to talk about hell realms. It's intriguing. It's a way we can work out our weirdest, darkest, deepest, anxieties and desires and play around with horrible ideas about, torturing people and whatnot. We do that by thinking through hells. So at the end, what are the big implications of this? One, the importance of impermanence that we see in Tibetan culture. They recognize death, that death is always coming, and that there are means to die well, that there are means for religious practice to die well, to die consciously, and to avoid negative rebirth. That there is a constant connection between morality and karma, and that carries over in our daily lives to our afterlives. And ultimately, we're all going to die. It's all death. If you're going to be a Buddhist, practice hard. If you have the idea, I'm not going to die today or tomorrow, you are not going to be called to act well. The Tibetan Buddhists will always say, realize you could die today or die tomorrow, so do what you're going to do. Write that novel. Do that Buddhist practice. Do whatever you need to do, because death is coming. And I think that's a good thing. I think we should be aware of the fleeting nature of life, and that should spur us to try to live well. So how do we live well? We live well by knowing that the end is always on its way. This is the end.